Thank you all, and thank you for coming to my talk on feature flags. So the agenda for today is I want to focus on, here's what I want to do. I want to focus on feature flags. Talk everything about what is a feature flag, what do they look like, what are some use cases. I will be discussing the difference between deployments and releases, which is a crucial aspect of using feature flags. Like if you take one thing out of this talk, if you understand the difference between a deployment and a release, I think that would be, and I don't mean to be like, I'm not being a know-it-all or anything, but I'm trying to deliver my version of what I feel is the difference between deployment and a release. So I hope if someone can take that out of this talk, I would consider my job well done. I want to jump into the meat of the talk after that with discussions on feature toggles, A/B testing, Canary Releases, and then I will finally talk about some feature flag frameworks and services that enable them. And I will end with some lessons learned. I'll call them tech considerations. These are not necessarily pros and cons because these include best practices, gotchas, lessons learned, and so on. This is kind of a broad, high-level talk of all these concepts, frameworks, and tools. And I will leave you with enough resources to do deep dives at your own convenience. So this is what we'll try to do in an hour. So a little bit about myself before I get started. I recently started working as a consultant at Microsoft. It's been about 3-ish months. I was also a Microsoft Azure MVP before that, and I run the Orlando.NET user group and Orlando Code Camp, which unfortunately we had to cancel in March because that's when COVID started peaking. But hope to be back in the future. And if you need to get in touch with me, you can use any of these venues. I feel like I'm always on Twitter, so you can have the best chance of finding me on Twitter. Everything that I'm about to present, whether that's a slide or a code, it's on this URL. So I will leave this up for a few seconds while I take a dramatic sip of my coffee. But if you go to this one, yeah, you pretty much have everything that's in my talk. So, just feel free to go there. It also has a slide with resources to start learning. So, all right. Hopefully you had the chance to take at least a screenshot of or open it up in a browser. Is my voice coming through loud and clear? Do I need to make any adjustments before I dive in? Yes, no, maybe so. Okay, great, thank you. So with that, I'll dive into feature flags. The first one I want to talk about is the definition. In software, a flag, and this is not anything new. It's used to store one or more bits and that store binary values. So a Boolean, it's true or false. In the same context, in software development, a feature is a chunk of functionality that delivers some kind of value. So thus, a feature flag is a combination of those two terms. It basically indicates that to break it down to its simplest terms, it's an if statement with some condition that surrounds a chunk of functionality in your software. In reality, feature flags they are definitely more complex than that, but some kind of a Boolean logic is part of a feature flag. A feature flag is it's a way to change your software's functionality without changing and redeploying your code. That's very important with feature flags. They could also be referred to as feature toggles. And they are basically it's set of patterns which can help your team deliver new functionality to users rapidly, but also safely. So in simplest terms, a feature, this is a sample of code in .NET Core. This involves like two different steps. The first step is you have a config setting that in your application settings. Now, this is the simplest way of doing it, and you read that config settings in C# code, and then you use that config setting in your code flow. So that's the simplest example of a feature flag. So going back to the components of a feature flag, the first one is a toggle point. The toggle point basically indicates the check point, or it's the if statement. Now, there may be multiple toggle points in your code, and there should be, in fact. And then the next component is a toggle router. The toggle router is actually, if you look at the toggle point and what's defined in there, it's the signature or the method that actually handles that. The next component of a feature flag is a context. So this is the set of conditions that the router takes into account while computing the feature flag. So in this particular case, the toggle context could be, if I want to see if a trial subscription is active, I may want to see what the account creation date was and what the number of trial days was, and probably add those to compute whether the result of this toggle point. And finally, there is a toggle configuration, and this could be something as simple as app settings config that simply says whether I'm going to enable or disable this toggle point. So I could simply tell people to not even use this toggle point. So that's a toggle configuration, and we will discuss all of this in detail. Before that, I want to dive into the differences between deployments and release. So I guess the easy way to say this is software teams use deployment and release interchangeably, which leads to a lot of confusion. Some other terms that software teams use is like ship. And these 3 or 4 terms are often used interchangeably. Shipping is more to do with business-facing entities, but it does complicate the situation further. So if you say something is deployed, does that mean that it's ready to ship? Is it ready to release? What are the implications of using those terms? So this is how myself and a set of people who subscribe to this school of thought define deployment. When we use the term deployment, we are talking about your team's process for putting the new version of your code on production infrastructure. So when I say a new version of software is deployed, it means that the new version of my software is running somewhere on production. But this does not mean that customers have access to this new version. So this is a set of all changes, as you can see. And because deployments do not necessarily mean that the customers can see them, you can deploy as often as you want. But as long as the customers cannot see them. So this makes it kind of low risk if you think about it. Deployments should have minimal impact to the customer, and deployments must be driven by the software teams. Which brings me to release. Release is a smaller set of the deployed changes. So I can say that, I deploy 5 different changes, but I only want to expose 3 of these to the customer. So what is a release? When I say a new feature is released, this means that production traffic is hitting the code that is delivering that feature. So unless production traffic hits it, it's not considered release. It's the process of pointing the production workflow to the point in code related to this new feature. When production traffic hits the new code, all the risks associated with releases come out. Like you could have, if the code is buggy, you could have outages, crashes, performance issues, and other items related to that. The decision to release new feature should involve other stakeholders beyond the software team. So it could be business-facing entities, it could be the C-level exec suite, it could be the product manager, project manager. So the whole bunch of other people become involved when you release your software. So depending on your team's practices, this is, you could also call it a rollout of your changes. So you're rolling out your changes. The advantage to separating deployments and release is that you can deploy your changes and you can release them at a later point. And if they fail, you should be able to unrelease it or roll back. So those are important aspects that we need to consider. So in summation, deployments and releases should be treated as 2 separate entities. Deployments preferably should be continuous, and they should have low impact to the customer. A release should be a mindful business decision, and they should have high impact to the customer. Hopefully, we can make this a positive impact or alleviate any negative issues with that. And the separation, so this is what it comes down to. You have deployment and releases. Those are basically involve the same code. The only difference between them is whether the client or the customer can see the new feature or not. And how we accomplish this? We accomplish this with something called feature flags. Okay, so are we good so far? Any questions, concerns? Am I good to go? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that. So, when I talk about feature flags, so we talked about deployments, we talked about releases, and we talked about the fact that deployments can be separated from releases using feature flags. So you have different types of feature flags. Simplest one is a toggle or kill switch. But you also have feature flags where you can do A/B testing, and there's something called Canary Releases. And I would like to talk about all of those with code samples. So, and again, like I said earlier, I will simply be walking through the code, not trying to run them in the allocated time. I provided the link at the beginning of the talk, and I'll show the link again at the end of the talk and maybe post it in the window, but you can use that link to download these code samples and play around with them. So they're very simple. It's really, if you understand C# and .NET and you have Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code, you can probably run most of this. So let's talk about kill switches or toggles. In simplest term, a toggle is an on-off button. So you can turn a feature on or you can turn it off with the toggle. And what this toggle does is it redirects the code in production on 2 different paths. or it skips a certain section depending on how you implement it. So uh, a well-wrapped feature means that you can quickly turn it off if it's performing poorly. This can prove the difference between a public relations disaster and minimal impact with the release. Uh, so what you're doing with the toggle is you're releasing your code and you're taking most of the risk of releases off the table. So I want to quickly dive into some code. So excuse me while I adjust my screen to do this, or I will try this. So what I want to do is I want to talk about a FeatureToggle. I will use a .NET framework with Visual Studio Web App or MVC Web App. I will implement. I'll kind of show you how to do this from scratch, but only obviously I won't be writing live code. And I'll show on-off toggling, but I'll also dive into some other things like date time based toggling, or even how to custom build your own toggling provider. So let me do this. I'll pull up my code on screen, and please let me know if you can read the text on the screen or if I need to increase the font size. Are we able to read this text? Do I need to up the font size? Okay. You see the PowerPoint slide. Okay, good point. Thank you. Thank you for that. That's why I'm looking for this feedback. This presentation software is new to me, so excuse me while I try to figure this out. Okay, so how is that? Looks good. Thank you. That's all I need. Appreciate it. So excuse me while I look at the code directly. So this is a simple ASP.NET web application, MVC web application. So there's nothing much to it. I just use the template to create this application. So what I'm going to do with this application is I will show you how to add toggling to this application. Correct. If you double click on the code window, it pops up and it becomes the main window. So please make sure you do that. Thank you for that. Thank you for that tip. So once you create an ASP.NET web application, you need to, obviously, the first thing we do is we figure out what libraries we need to add to support what we're doing. So let's look at the NuGet packages. So in the NuGet packages, what I do is I add this NuGet package called FeatureToggle. Now FeatureToggle adds, when I add this, it adds two different libraries, FeatureToggle and FeatureToggle.common. Now this is an open source, like if you look at the link for this library, it's done by a guy called Jason Roberts, and it's an oldish library. It was open source. You can actually go in and read the source to see how each feature toggle was implemented and customize it, or even create your own. So the one thing I'll caution you about this library is that it doesn't appear to be under active development at this point in time. So don't expect changes or support or anything like that. But what's out there so far is pretty good. Like this is how I got started with feature toggles a few years back, by using this library. The other thing is easy to understand. It's easy to get started. So you can use this as a playground. So I need to make sure I add this. So the next thing is I'll talk about a few ways of doing feature toggles. So the first way is I simply put a Boolean value, and I use that Boolean value to kind of pass pass it into my controller. In my controller, I use a if loop to show or not show a feature. Right here, I use a if loop to show or not show the feature based on that Boolean value. So, right, so we kind of at this point accept that we can pass a Boolean value in, and that will either show a feature or not show a feature, which is effectively a toggle. So the old way of doing this was, let's open up our web config. So in our web config, we used to put in we used to define a Boolean, and then what we would do is in our code, we'd use the configuration manager.app settings and then read that value. But this is the old way of doing it, right? So there's a few issues with this. Number one is obviously you have to put in a whole bunch of null checks and Boolean checks and everything else to make sure that this doesn't fail. But you will also see that this particular value that pulls from the app settings is hard-coded. Now, it's a magic string. Now, whenever I see magic strings, it starts to make me really nervous in code. It's the most common code smell, right? Like magic strings. So I would prefer not to use a magic string. What I want to do is I would rather use something that's a strongly typed value instead of using a magic string. So this is how I can do a strongly typed value. So the first one I do is I implement a simple feature. So what the simple feature is, it's a simple on or off. And this is how I can do it with FeatureToggle. So looking at this kind of inherits from the FeatureToggle library that we just added. And it's called a simple FeatureToggle. And I build a class based on the simple FeatureToggle. And as you can see, there's no like crazy things that I'm doing to this class. How does this work? So looking at the simple FeatureToggle, I go back to my web config, and I see that the simple FeatureToggle, all I'm doing is I'm defining a true or false for that in my web config. So this library, what it's doing is it's taking this, it knows what value to look for because I use the namespace FeatureToggle, and then based on my class name, it'll go and fetch the value from the web config. So going back to my code, I define a class that inherits from simple FeatureToggle. And then to check whether the value is true or false, I simply use this section of code that says, is the feature enabled? So if this was false in the web config, this would simply become false. And if this was true, it would simply become true. So the one thing this does is it actually prevents me from using magic strings in my within my C# code. So everything gets pushed to the config side. So let's say I took my, let's look at this. So in my previous example, if I tried to define hard code that value in my C# code, and I deployed my software out to production, if I had to toggle it, then I'd have to change this to false. I have to change this true to false and redeploy it. But because I have it in this example, obviously this is a magic string, so I don't want to use this. So in my next example, with a simple feature flag, all I'm doing is I'm going to production and I'm changing this false to true. So that to me takes away the pain of redeploying the software. So you can start to see where this is going. I'm starting to go away from actually redeploying my software every time I need to make a change. Okay, so then you tell me, okay, great, you did a true or false. This is great. I mean, but that's, the most simplest case. That's not how I really want to release my software. I would like to release my software based on a time window. So there is something for that. You have various date-based toggles that Simple Toggle offers you. So you could have enabled, you have between certain dates. So I could provide an upper and lower bound for the dates. I could say enabled on certain days of the week. So I could say it's only enabled on Monday through Friday, and I don't want it Saturday, Sunday. You have enabled on or after dates, enabled on or before dates. So most often what people do is they like to enable their feature on certain dates. Like if I was releasing something that was being used for Thanksgiving Day sales, I'd like to enable that on or after date. So as you can see, I simply create another class that inherits from a class that belongs to FeatureToggle, and I define the values in my web config. So this I can say on or after, and today's date is 8/21. So I'll say it's on or after 21st of August 2020. So starting, or if I don't want it enabled for today, I simply turn this to 22nd August, or I can even narrow it down to specific date times seconds. So good question. So is this compatible with core? So FeatureToggle has, FeatureToggle does, it is compatible with core because you can see that going back to this, it uses code based on .NET standard packages. So there is a version that's compatible with core. I will give you a word of warning that FeatureToggle has not been maintained lately. So if you're looking for compatibility with the latest versions of .NET Core, I have options for that coming up soon. So yes, it is, but take that with a word of caution. You may have to jerry-rig stuff for it to work. Yeah, glad to explain that. So, you have the date feature. So, this is still lacking something to me. So what this is lacking is that I don't want to have to go in and mess around with my config file in production, right? Like, that's not good practice. This is taking you away from having to redeploy code, but still having you mess with a config file in production. So FeatureToggle also has, you can build a custom feature, and in the custom feature, what you can do is you can implement your own implementation of the feature enable. So I could have this feature enabled. Right now, I'm just returning a hard-coded value, but I could write a web API call that goes and looks at a web endpoint, a REST-based endpoint that returns a true or false. So I could start, you see where this is going. It can actually, I'm starting to take it away. Like I started by, separating the deployment from release. Now I'm starting to gain more and more control over how I release. So with this one, I can read it from a web app. I can read it from a centralized database. So what happens if you're using this flag in a microservice, right? So you could have like 5 different microservices that you want to toggle on at the same time for a feature to show up on Thanksgiving Day. So at that point, you don't want to go into each microservice and have to change the config file. That's really a recipe for disaster, right? So instead of that, what I would do is I'd implement a custom toggle, and this custom toggle, I would start, pointed to a REST-based interface or a database, centralized database entity. I use microservices, and I'm talking about sharing databases, but again, it's not specific to the functioning of that microservice, but rather to a overall control for these services. So just trying to provide some examples. Don't take this as gospel, but trying to show how we can control our releases better. So again, everything is strongly typed, and there's no uh, there's no I'm able to release toggle dates on or off. So, it's a simple on-off toggle. I'm able to release based on dates, and I can also control it better. So, this is kind of what I wanted to show with this particular software, FeatureToggle. If you have not done feature flags before, this is a great place to get started. Again, I have all the code samples and material behind that on my GitHub site, and I'll put that link up at the end. So next thing I wanted to do is I will switch back to my presentation mode, so please bear with me. Okay, so back to presentation. So the goal of this demo was to introduce you to feature toggling and show you on-off, date-time based toggling, and also custom toggle providers where you can control your toggling better rather than using an app config file. So the next thing I want to talk about is A/B testing. So A/B testing is a term that comes from the days of e-commerce when people wanted to release features, but they wanted to, or sorry, they didn't want to release features. They wanted to release products. So it's a question of if let's say I want someone to buy my product, right? Is this so psychologically speaking? Is this person more likely to click on a blue button, or is this person more likely to click on a green button? So what we started to do back in those days was simply put a if loop and randomly display the blue and green button and count which one got clicked more. And that was considered the conversion rate. So you probably heard this term from people who do marketing, the conversion rates. So that's how this was done. As you throw up two different instances, maybe even randomly or 50-50, and figure out which one works better. And it's a process of showing two different variants of the feature to different segments of customers at the same time and comparing which variant drives more conversion. And the one that converts higher is considered the winning one, although I would say that that is a little bit of voodoo science. So it works, but it's not always true. But this is a good example to provide for that. So for A/B testing, what I want to do is, speaking of .NET Core, I'd like to show something called feature management, a .NET Core somewhat newish feature in .NET Core called feature management. I will show you how to. Should have probably done this. I'll show you how to set up and create a centralized repo for handling feature toggles. It's called Azure App Configuration. And I'll show you how to set up and run A/B testing by splitting by percentage. So first thing in that particular aspect would be I would need to create the Azure app configuration. So what I'll do is I will, if you're able to see my screen, or do I need to make this more zoomed in? I'll probably zoom in just to be 100% sure. So I can create a new resource and I call it app configuration. And that creates a resource called app configuration. This is somewhat of a newish feature in Azure. So I define a resource group. I will call this again, this is all Azure stuff. So in order to create a resource in Azure, I have to create a resource group. I'll call it Code PaLOusa 2020 resource group. And I'll create a new USCs, and I'll call my app configuration feature Code PaLOusa 2020 app config. And I'll create the free version because that's enough for the purposes of this demo. So while this is creating, I will switch back to my slide and I'll talk about this further. So the next thing I need for my app configuration to work is code. So as you can see, I have .NET Core code. It's .NET Core 3.1. And obviously, I specify user secrets because when you develop locally, you store secrets and user secrets. And that way, when you push up your code, you can replicate what's in user secrets on whatever infrastructure it is you're running in the config files, and it'll simply work. But I need two different libraries. So I'm using Microsoft.featuremanagement.asp.NET Core version 2.0. And I'm using Microsoft.azure.appconfiguration.asp.NET Core. So this one actually creates the toggles in the code, and this one talks to the app configuration resource that I'm creating. So the next thing I need to do to set this up is I need to go to startup, and in my configure services method in my startup, I'll simply add feature management. This will allow me to use feature management and in the code, feature management code. So next thing I need to do is I need to connect it to app configuration. So I will add a line in here to use app configuration in the configure method. And then in my program, I'm going to specify the app configuration settings. So I'll need a connection string. So where do I get this connection string from? Going back to the resource I created, if it finished deploying, I will go to access keys, and the access keys will provide me a connection string. So at this point, what I would do is I would copy this connection string, and I can, obviously you don't want to copy paste it into your C# code, so you'll add it to your secrets, and when your program runs, it'll simply pick up the connection string. And then what I'm saying is that I want to use the feature flags part of app config. And going back to app config, you can actually store your configuration settings as key value pairs. So, but that's not the part I'm using. I'm using feature management. So to create a feature flag, what I would do is I would set a feature flag like beta, and then I can turn it on or off from here. So let's turn it on and create it. So that's all that's needed. So what's going to happen with my code is going back to my code. It will connect. It will connect to the Azure app configuration using using the connection string, and it will use the feature flags feature. Now, one thing that's a little bit tricky is because I'm doing this in my program at the startup of the program, once it reads the value, it tends to keep it in cache. So my understanding with the Azure app configuration feature flags is that the cache is maintained for 30 seconds. If I want to make it faster, I could reduce that by setting the cache expiration. Now, there's also aspects of you could use cache expiration in development, but not in production, because in production you don't want to be constantly checking your cache. So just some of the business practices you have to be mindful about. So once I have this, how would I use this beta? So I can actually, with the Azure app config or with Azure Feature Management, it actually allows me to use uh, features at a deep, at almost like the framework level. So I can add a tag helper for Azure Feature Management, and then the next thing I'm doing is in my layout, I'm saying that I only want this beta link to show up if I uh, if I have this feature enabled. So if this feature is disabled, my beta link won't even show up. So kind of I'm testing between two different options, and I'm showing or I'm exposing a beta option by doing this. So with having done this, everything else looks the same as in ASP.NET Core MVC, but it gives adding the feature management library gives me this extra tag that I can use to hide or not hide features. The for the implementation, obviously, you add a controller. The controller, first of all, I'll have a feature flag that I'm injecting into the controller. And I'm using that feature, that flag as a gate. So when this flag is set to on or off, this gate feature actually prevents it from being displayed. So that's so the question I have is, do I understand correctly the Azure app configuration is just a way to create possibility to remotely control feature flags? So yes, so the answer it depends. There are other frameworks that you can use to remotely control feature toggling. Azure app configuration is a way you can do it with .NET Core uh, feature management because it ties in very well to that. Now, another way of doing this, and actually let me do this. I will pull up my code samples, and that may be a useful discussion to have. So I'll just go to my code samples. So I will post this in our window. But if you look at the source in my code samples, and you will see that I have Azure app configuration, but I also have the code for something called Launch Darkly. Launch Darkly is another third-party software as a service provider that allows you to remotely control feature toggling. So yes, to answer your question, Azure app config does it, but you can also, there's also another tool that's used widely in the industry. It's called Launch Darkly. So I wanted to make sure that I also showed that. So all my code samples are in here. So I have not updated that recently, but it should work. If it doesn't, just ping me on Twitter and I'll help you with that. So anyway, so when you run this code, based on whether you set this to on or off, like you can see, you can literally toggle it on or off. So you can also do this with PowerShell or Azure CLI. No, that's fine. It's a good question. I always like questions. Uh, so based on whether you toggle this on or off, this feature gate actually will show this feature or not. So that's one way to implement feature toggling and in ASP.NET Core. And I will try to speed up a little bit now. So what I'm going to do is talk about Canary Releases, because we kind of talked about A/B testing. That's easy. We can centralize the control by using Azure App Config with .NET Core. But these days, most of the software releases often use a technique called Canary Release. So there's the story of a canary in a coal mine. If it stops singing, then there is trouble, right? So similarly, when you deploy code, You don't want to deploy the code straight to production or release it to all users. What you want to do is you want to release it to a small set of users. And if these small set of users start complaining about issues, then you know that there's an issue instead of the whole market complaining. So uh, it's so the thing about Canary Releases is you'll also hear about blue-green deployment, and I'll talk about that later. But blue-green deployment involves infrastructure. Blue-green deployment also involves infrastructure, but Canary Releases is purely code-based. So if you're happy with the new releases, you can start rolling out the changes to more and more users. Microsoft has the concept of ring releases. So you'd hear like inside a ring and other things. So it uses ring releases similar to Canary Releases for Windows and Azure DevOps. So the concept of Canary Releases is as the new version proves itself to be not buggy or actually working, then you can release it. So the migration phase, because Canary Releases, you do it slowly by users, it could last for weeks. So while it helps you release your code in batches, which is great, the downside, and we should always talk about downside of anything we do, right? The downside of this is you would have to maintain multiple versions until you finish the rollout to all users. So I'll quickly go to the code to Canary Releases, talk about the Canary Releases code, and what I'll do is I'll be using Azure ASP.NET MVC. So if you look at my project, it's a similar project. It's a console application, .NET Core 3.1. So I'm using only feature management over here, but I'm using kind of a preview feature because this is still upcoming, but I have the latest code out here, so you can try it out. It uses a feature library, preview library. So if you want to do Canary Releases right now with .NET Core, keep in mind that it's in preview. So you may want to hold, by the time you develop a feature, it's possible that they would have rolled out the new code. But don't take my word for that. Check with a member of the .NET Core team. So in this release, what I'm doing is I'm rolling it out to multiple users. And the way to do this is in my program, I'm adding the app settings, and then I'm adding something called a contextual. I'm adding feature management first of all in my main program, and then I'm adding a feature filter, and I'm using something called contextual targeting, and that's the filter that actually helps me target users. And I'll show you how to target users in a second, but I want to quickly walk through this. So first of all, it uses the feature manager, and then I have a repository of features from in-memory. But in your production app, you'd probably get users from a database or something like that. And as I toggle through each user, I'm using the targeting context. Sorry, one second. I'm using the targeting context to check if this user should be targeted or not. And if the user is targeted, then the feature is enabled for them. And so, yeah, pretty straightforward as once you start getting the hang of it. And to target the actual user, all I'm doing is I am specifying a feature management setting in app config. Now, keep in mind, I can do this with Azure App Configuration also, but this is in preview. And in app config, for the beta feature, I have enable for flag. And for the enable for flag, and this is the important part, I'm using a namespace called Microsoft.targeting, which actually tells the library that should use the targeting context feature. And in the audience, you can see that I can target the user by name. So if you look at my code, I had the user ID or name, uh, or I can say that uh, I want to target the user by their group. So looking at my user class, you see that I specify the ID, which is, in this case, I'm using their first name as ID, but I can also specify the groups. And if you look at my users, I'm saying that, hey, this is their ID, and they either belong to a group, like a ring, or they may not belong to a group. So this would be, some users belong to ring 0, some users belong to ring 1, and so on. So I'm simply specifying in my app settings which rings I should, or which users I should target. And it always helps to have a mix of users, because you often have your customers that may belong to rings, but then you may have internal people or testers who may be targeted by user ID. So you can use either option. So that's how this program works. It simply uses the targeting context, it pulls up the user, and it checks to see if it's enabled for them or not. So, and this is ring releases, because what I'm doing is I'm actually specifying a percentage of users that I can roll this out to. So ring 0, like my internal users, I want to roll 100%, but ring 1, which is my partners, I want to roll just 20% of the usage. So that's these code samples. Again, I have them. I posted the link in the window. Feel free to consume them. I want to walk through the rest of the talk, starting with the frameworks. So the FeatureToggle frameworks. We actually discussed all of these. I just want to go over them real quick. So FeatureToggle, it gave you strongly typed, and you could build, you could use existing ones or customize. Like with the .NET Core feature management, it would be hard for me to dig into Microsoft's code and customize, but this FeatureToggle library allows you to do that. The downside, obviously, is the project is kind of dormant, so there's no inbuilt telemetry. With feature management, this is Microsoft's brand new library. Obviously, you can use this. You can use config file, or you can use app config to centralize the feature or toggling. With Azure App Config, that's a platform as a service, and you can manage application settings and feature flags. You can also, you saw in code where I could refresh those flags. So your application can actually have, as soon as you toggle it, your application can sense that and react to it. The other advantages of using platform as a service is you can make it strongly secure. You can integrate with Azure Key Vaults, and it's very friendly to infrastructure as code. It supports multiple SDKs. And finally, I talked about Launch Darkly a little bit, but I don't have the time to dive into that today, but it's a software as a service, and it's a very mature framework. It's been around for a while, mostly used outside of the .NET world, but these days people in the .NET world use it widely. Like even, I think Microsoft uses that. And Launch Darkly is really cool. I have some material in there about Launch Darkly, so feel free to create an account and play around with a test account on Launch Darkly. Which one should you use? I'm a consultant, so I will always say it depends. But one thing, a few directions I can give is if you're doing greenfield .NET Core development, then you can use feature management and Azure App Config. If it's an existing app, Launch Darkly provides options that Azure App Config may not have yet. So maybe look at that. Especially if you have non-technical users. Non-technical users find the interface of Launch Darkly really easy to use. The other thing is you can use .NET Core and FeatureToggle, but knowing that the FeatureToggle library is a little bit out of, it needs a little bit of maintenance. If you have extreme code customization, I would just use FeatureToggle. Are you able to use feature management with a non-Azure? Yes, you can. Yes, you can. I don't have sample code for that, but I think you can customize it. Uh, I will follow up on that one. I don't have the details for that one, but yes, I have had discussions and I know that you can do that. I don't have the particular details. No problem. Thank you. Some things you need to know about feature flags, blue-green deployment. Again, blue is current, green is new. So what you do is you deploy to green servers, and then you simply flip over the user to green servers. If it doesn't work, you can go back to the blue ones. So that's blue-green deployment, and it's infrastructure-based. So everything we discussed so far was code-based, and so I prefer code-based myself. But blue-green deployment is really useful in certain cases. Again, I have everything about it in my notes, so just go through that. Feature flags, keep in mind that when you add a if loop that's used for a feature you're releasing, that's technical debt. So go out and review your feature flags periodically, clean them out. Do not daisy chain feature flags. So if you have if feature flag 1 is toggled and if feature flag 2 is untoggled, then release this feature. Don't do that. That's really asking. Keep it simple. That if you daisy chain them, that could lead to unpredictable behavior. Use small batches. There's a story about Microsoft release back in 2013 when we did a TFS release and flipped on all the feature flags at once. Do we clean code after feature was released? If you're 100% sure that the feature is working, I would go ahead and clean it up. There's no point in keeping dead code around. Literally, if the if loop, it's always going inside the if loop, and you obviously use telemetry to decide that. And if it's always going inside the if loop, then yeah, go ahead and remove the if part of it and just let the code flow straight. Do not daisy chain feature flag. Measure everything. Going back to what I was just speaking about, make sure that you have telemetry. How many times is it going inside the feature flags? How many times is it bypassing the feature flags? Are there any errors that are happening? So have everything on a dashboard, or at least have some place that you're checking frequently. Because if you do not, then it becomes technical debt automatically. The other thing with feature flags is, while it's tempting to roll out your own framework, try to use existing framework. And again, I say this about everything: feature flags, security, anything that you do, always try to use an existing framework. If it does 80% of the work, just use it. Don't roll your own unless you're extremely bored. So focus on feature flags are meant to solve business problems, right? So you're releasing features. That's a business problem. Focus on solving business problems by leveraging what the abilities feature flag frameworks give you. Do not try to roll your own unless it's core to your central business, or you're doing it as a side project or some kind of experimentation. So as a consultant, I often come across CAB, or change advisory boards, and the change advisory boards often require features to go through them before being released. But what happens because of this approach is that you're not able to deploy your code with any frequency because you have to get approved by the change advisory board. So what you can do is you can put all the code that you're going to release in a future release in a feature flag, and then keep deploying it. And because this code is not visible to the customers, you can pretty much, you don't require as much of you don't get in as much trouble with the change advisory board. And when the time is ready, the number one thing a change advisory board will ask you is, how do you roll this back? And so if you show them how to do this with feature flags, it makes your work much easier. when you're going through if you ever encounter a change in device report. So always try to leverage feature flags and separate deployments from releases. And finally, don't use long-lived branches for development. In fact, this is a quote from Accelerate. With feature flags, the release of software to users becomes a business decision instead of a technical decision. The execution of a section of code or features no longer needs a dedicated source code branch, but it becomes an execution branch. So don't let your code live in long-lived branches. Just deploy frequently and merge your code frequently. So we talked about all of these items that we discussed. My call to action is, use feature flags. Just start playing around with them, start leveraging them. And if you come across an interesting use case, I'm always happy to hear about it. I posted this link in the window, so make sure that you visit that and at least use that to get started in certain aspects. If you need to get in touch with me, I'm on Twitter, or you can first name dot last name at Microsoft or LinkedIn. I appreciate you contacting me in any way. Looking forward to hearing from you. And these are some of the resources that I went through while creating this talk. These are not the only resources, but these are the most useful ones. So that is all I have. So I will, if there are any questions, I'll go ahead and take those, and I'll stop sharing. Thank you, Andre. Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Blake. Again, if you have questions, drop them in the window. I will be happy to share. Again, I'll add the links to my talks in the community channels at some point today. So thank you very much. Thank you for coming to this talk. And I appreciate you all. Stay safe. Have a good rest of the conference, and hope to see you all someday in person. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks, Blake. I appreciate that. Yeah, I do want my internet back too. Thank you. Bye.